Whispering Woods is forging ahead, despite the setbacks. Genevieve Joyce is determined to battle SylvaCorp International, especially knowing her brothers Tristan and Xander are working for the greedy corporation. With Sylvester Kane, owner of SylvaCorp, closing the Namibia Wildlife Shelter, Omari Achebe has returned to Madagascar's Lemur Lifeline, and though there are still lemurs left to save, there are also Fossas in need of rehoming. Arthur Joyce and Anna Kingston are joining hands in this exhibit design, and spending more time together in general. In the midst of it all, Jonathan Vaughn is taking a step back from Whispering Woods to take care of a few matters, but Charlotte Baker is willing to take up the ledgers while he is gone. Regardless of what's happening behind the scenes, guests are still streaming through the doors, and for right now, that's all that matters. Welcome back to Whispering Woods, Wildlife Haven. Hey everyone, Sparrow here. We're moving on from the desert today to something far more tropical, Madagascar. Over by the Lemur Outpost is where we'll be designing our brand new Fossa habitat. And just in time too, as the weather is finally getting slightly warmer where I am, and I'm hopeful that flowering plants and rain are on the way, just like in the Malagasy forest we'll be building today. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and even if you're not, hit that bell icon. A few people have let me know they're not getting notifications, so it's always good to double check. But enough of that, let's talk about today's build. This simple timber and metal fence will be the base of our habitat, and being the perfectionist I am, I made sure that the slats lined up exactly as they should, even though this will be the inside of the habitat and hardly anyone will be seeing it anyway. It did give me a new appreciation for the multi-axis tool. I remember when this feature first came out, I kept hitting it by accident and absolutely hating it because I wanted to use the arrows, but it is actually surprisingly useful. To give the guests a view into the enclosure, I knocked out part of the wall and replaced it with a piece of glass. There will be 2 small viewing areas for guests in this, admittedly strangely shaped enclosure. I once again decided to challenge myself, and by that I mean absolutely hate my life at one point during this build, and the walls are slightly curved at both viewpoints. For the purposes of not hating myself completely, I did make sure to leave rotation snap on, so each segment is 15 degrees from the previous, and that did do some things for my sanity. The back of the enclosure will feature a pretty nondescript green chain link fence. I created this with some metal beams, mesh, and grassland poles, and it will outline a staff path that runs behind the Fossa enclosure, right between it and the Lemur Outpost area, for a bit of breathing room and also shortcuts that are available only to our staff. Whispering Woods staff will be able to access it through this gate, which security has helpfully placed this sign on for us. To make sure the guests aren't trying to look into our Fossa enclosure from back here, I also put up some fabric to shield the view of the staff path and, by extension, the habitat just beyond. The guest path will run along this curve at the front of the enclosure. I placed the path in front of the viewing windows first and then connected that along the edges of our custom barrier. The solid barrier between the viewing areas will have staff access to the indoor area for the Fossas, and that's where we'll eventually be placing our staff gate. Now, I did initially design this enclosure in a way where we could have 2 separate Fossa spaces, but it was just shy of the space requirements and it was too much of a hassle to redo everything, so the animals will have access to both parts and we'll just have a breeding pair in here. Might be contemplating some mods that decrease the space requirements a bit more seriously at this point. Now comes the fun part, the roof of the enclosure. To imply netting, I set up my brackets. These ones are more heavy duty than usual as this is a pretty dangerous animal, and the metal cables from the Zookeeper pack do a great job of implying sturdy supports from which mesh could hang. I know I complain about rotating things on multiple axes quite often, but I think I've done enough implied aviaries at this point that this step didn't feel too incredibly difficult. Or maybe just the method I've been following has made it a lot easier. But I set up my endpoints here first, then used the position snap tool to get my cables in, and made sure they all met up in the same location. Not necessarily the center, no need to be completely mathematically correct here, but close enough that it looks passable. I think that's the biggest YouTube secret. And what we do to one side, we must do to the other, as I tell my students for many mathematical operations, so the other part of the enclosure got its own pentagonal roof structure. Finally, it was time to get some climbing in, and thanks to our cables, I could see just how tall we could make these structures. Did a lot of back and forth between the enclosure and the viewing windows just to see what the guest view would look like, and also made sure to add plenty of rocks to add more height to the ground level. I do think that rocks should count towards climbing for certain animals, especially if they're large rocks with crevices that would take more skill to climb. That just makes sense in my head. Let me know if that's something you agree or disagree with in the comments below. Anyway, as far as climbing goes, I've been obsessed with this little bridge. I think it's so cute, so I had to make it part of this enclosure. Once that was in, it looks like the Fossa has plenty of space, both on the ground and climbing levels, but those escape points are a little bit jarring. More on that later. Instead, let's hop inside this building where we'll just have a super simple mesh fence and gate with bedding for the Fossa, and then I'll cover that all up with some plastic rectangles for a roof because if you can tell from the video, it started to rain in our UK-based zoo. Surprise, surprise. I also added the planted panels to the roof to make this space seem more tropical. Finally, it was time to tackle those escape points. For some reason, even though I used non-climbable wood for the barriers, the Fossas could still get out, which meant that I had to mesh over the top of the enclosure, which is something that I had been trying to avoid. But no matter, we'll go back to our tried and tested trick with the plastic rectangles. Line those up with the edges of the space or our metal cables, and then fill that in with mesh pieces, larger ones in the center, and then far too many smaller pieces along the edges to make sure there were no holes. All in all, there were about 15 sections to fill in, some of them more flat than others along the edges, but meshing over this enclosure took about 5 hours of my life, so please hit that like button, I would really appreciate it. It's time to turn this enclosure into the tropical paradise I promised in the beginning, so enjoy this sparrow montage that's been missing from recent videos as I do so. With our netting back in place, the Fossas finally can't escape, but we're not quite done yet. The exterior of the habitat needs some treatment, and for that we'll do some quick stop motion of a fountain that I decided to build to draw guests into this area. It's modern but natural with copper and wood elements. Coupled with the water effects, I use decal panels to simulate water. They are an amazing reflective piece. And plenty of foliage, including tropical plants in wooden planters that can be moved out during the cold seasons. And with all of those details added, let's go see our Fossa friends. The Fossa is an incredible species and we're so happy to have them at the Haven. The Fossa is swift, agile, and cunning, moving flat-footed along the forest floor or, more commonly, through the trees. An ambushed predator, it can outmaneuver even the fastest lemur. With friends like these, who needs enemies? And yet, SylvaCorp International continues to loom as a threat. Whispering Woods has a lot of recon to do, and we're happy you're here to join us. Hit that join button if you want the behind-the-scenes view of the Haven. Here are our current members. See the story unfold next time. Bye.